American freedmen, did you know? Thinking face indigenous people was here before the arrival of Christopher Columbus here in ancient America, better known as Turtle Island. A treaty of alliance was made in 1756 between the Cherokees, Catawbas, and North Carolina. During this year, the Earl of London, having been appointed commander-in-chief of the British forces in the American colonies, sent Major Andrew Lewis to build the third fort in the Cherokee Nation. He located it on the Tennessee River within 5 miles of Schauta, the capital of the nation. The English translation of Echauta is place of rest. The English ordinarily spelled the name Chota. This fort was named London in honor of the Earl. It was garrisoned with 2 Scotch companies under Captains Paul Demere and John Stuart and was over 150 miles from the nearest white settlement. General Braddock, marching to attack Fort Duquesne with a well-equipped army of more than 2,000 regulars and the famous Virginia militia, was met in an ambush on the Monongahela River by 72 French regulars, 250 Canadian volunteers and 637 Indians under Captain Marie de Beaulieu, and ingloriously defeated. The French had already ingratiated themselves with all the western Indians except the Cherokees, and the effect of Braddock's defeat was to encourage the Indians to scour the frontier in large and small bodies, killing, burning, and destroying. The tide of emigration that had for several years steadily flowed westward over the Alleghenies commenced to rapidly recede. During this time, Colonel George Washington wrote to his former employer, Lord Fairfax, that 350 wagons had crossed one ford of the Monocacy River, eastbound, within 3 days. Colonels William Byrd and Peter Randolph were deputed by the colony of Virginia in November 1755 to treat with the Cherokees for their active cooperation. As Colonel George Washington expressed it, "Without Indians we will be unable to cope with the cruel foes of our country." Major Andrew Lewis had led a company of Cherokees in an attack on the Shawnees, who were allies of the French, and while on their return a party of them was entertained by a back settler in Augusta County, Virginia, and when they had taken their leave, some of his friends, whom he had placed in ambush for that purpose, fired upon and killed several of them. Those who escaped arrived in their towns just as Byrd and Randolph were on the point of concluding their treaty. Great excitement ensued, and but for the devotion of Silone and the wisdom and tact of Echauta, the treaty would not only have been defeated, but the commissioners themselves would have been killed. Echauta hastened to apprise the commissioners of their danger, warning them to stay within their tent, and on no account to appear abroad. Silone saved the lives of the commissioners by standing in their tent door and telling a body of warriors that before they got to the commissioners, they would have to kill him, as Colonel Byrd was his friend. In addressing the council, Echauta expressed the indignation that they all felt at the treachery of the Virginians and declared he would have full satisfaction for the blood of 28 history of the Cherokee Indians, his countrymen. Let us not, however, he added, violate our faith, or the laws of hospitality, by imbruing our hands in the blood of those who are now in our power. They came to cement a perpetual alliance with us. Let us carry them back to their own settlement, conduct them safely to their confines, and then take up the hatchet and endeavor to exterminate the whole race of them. A treaty of alliance was finally concluded. For 3 years the Cherokees adhered to their promise made in the treaty and defended the western frontier, rendered every aid possible to the settlers, and when General Forbes assembled his levies to attack the French, a large number of Cherokees joined him at Winchester, Virginia. Dr. John Forbes, a Scotch physician, who had been serving in the Canadian service as a lieutenant colonel, was promoted to a brigadier generalship by James Abercrombie, the new British commander-in-chief, early in 1758. General Forbes was a strict disciplinarian who profited much by correcting many of the military mistakes of Braddock. He was domineering, petulant, and at that time in such bad health that he had to be carried on a litter and died in March 1759. He did not understand the irregular, but effective mode of warfare as practiced by his Cherokee allies, and his irritable complaints and continuous insults, even to the magnanimous Echauta, caused the Cherokees to quit his command on November 15, 1758, 10 days before his reduction of Fort Duquesne. On the 19th the general ordered that they be intercepted, their horses, guns and ammunition be taken from them, and if they protested, they should be stripped of everything except their breechclouts and then escorted back to their nation, to prevent them from reprisals. Thus the only tribe that had been faithful allies of the English for the last 37 years, after having been driven from the army by the continuous petty insults of the commander, was offered this last indignity, and this, by the orders of the general, must be executed by Colonel Byrd, whose life had been saved in 1755 by Echauta, who was on this latter occasion the commander of the Cherokees. In addition to this, the colonial Indian affairs of the army, which was under the control of Edmund Atkin, Indian agent, were so badly managed that, instead of receiving the encouragement their services and bravery merited, they were met by what they considered injustice, neglect, and contempt. At one time 10 of them were imprisoned on suspicion of being spies in the French interest. Another party, after having undergone the perils and privations of their long march, went into action in their destitute condition, behaved nobly and rendered valuable service to the colony, but on returning with their trophies of honor, found neither agent nor interpreter to reward or thank them, nor anyone who could tell them why they were thus neglected. But for the intervention and kind treatment of Colonel George Washington, they must have returned to their nation, tired with just resentment, if not open war, against their allies. The Cherokees were attacked as they were returning from Forbes Camp by some of the back settlers, the very same people that they had gratuitously protected. But the settlers did not discriminate between friendly Indians and enemy Indians, but set upon and killed 12 or more of the unsuspecting Cherokees, alleging that they had stolen some of their horses. History of the Cherokee Indians 29. Til warriors clamored for war, but the old chiefs persuaded them to wait until they had asked satisfaction from the colonies, in accordance with treaty stipulations. They sought reparation and satisfaction from Virginia, then North Carolina, and afterwards South Carolina, but in vain. War, them only alternative, began. Among others, 2 soldiers of the garrison at Fort London, who were out hunting, were killed. Governor Littleton, of South Carolina, mobilized the colonial militia in the vicinity of the Congaree to march against the Cherokees. Oconostota and 31 other chiefs visited the governor at Charlestown in an attempt to settle affairs. He told them that he would make his demands known only when he had reached them country, and if they were not granted, he would take satisfaction by force of arms, that they must follow his army back to the nation. Upon Oconostota arising to protest, the governor forced him to be seated and would not allow him to utter a word. The chiefs were forced to march behind the army to the Congarees, where they were made prisoners, taken to Fort Prince George, and shut up in a room that was scarcely large enough for the accommodation of 6 persons. The governor's military ire cooled in proportion to the distance that he got from Charlestown. When he arrived at Fort Prince George, he sent for Echauta, the known friend of the English, and upon that chief's arrival, he insolently demanded the 24 Cherokees who had been accused of killing whites. Echauta promised to do whatever he could in their delivery and asked that some of the prisoners be freed so that they might assist in the endeavor. Echauta and 7 others were accordingly liberated, and the others, although they had gone as peace envoys, were detained. 2 of the Indians that had been demanded were brought in and exchanged for 2 of the imprisoned chiefs, and an agreement was entered into on December 26, 1859, that the others would be delivered, but they had fled and could not be apprehended. Despairing of being able to rescue the prisoners by any other means, Echauta asked the commander of Fort Prince George for a conference, and Captain Cottamore, Lieutenant Dougherty, Ensign Bill, and their interpreter, Foster, met Lim on February 16, 1760, the parties being in opposite banks of the Savannah River. At a signal from Echauta, some warriors who had been hidden near him fired and wounded all 4 of the party from the fort, the captain being so severely wounded that he died 2 or 3 days later. The Indians stormed the fort but were repulsed, and the 22 hostages were killed. War, with all of its dreaded consequences, was now on, and the backsetters appealed in vain to Governor Nicholson. Colonel Montgomery, who carried as later Earl Eglinton v/as dispatched from New York to Charlestown, from whence he marched against the Cherokees, raised the siege on May 1, 1760, that Echauta was conducting against Fort Prince George, and on June 27, 1760, he destroyed Echauta, which had been deserted by its inhabitants, but on account of the incessant attacks it became necessary for him to retreat, and in doing so he had to destroy and abandon all of his surplus supplies in order to expedite his progress. He reached Charlestown and sailed for New York. At the same time that Echauta attacked Fort Prince George, William.
We continue in the book View of the Hebrews by Ethan Smith. And he says, the North American reviewers, in reviewing a sermon of Dr. Jarvis on this subject, delivered before the New York Historical Society, in which he attempts to adduce much evidence to show that the natives of this continent are the tribes of Israel, remarked thus: the history and character of the Indian tribes of North America, which have for some time been a subject of no inconsiderable curiosity and interest with the learned in Europe, have not till lately attracted much notice among ourselves. But as the Indian nations are now fast vanishing, and the individuals of them come less frequently under our observation, we also, as well as our European brethren, are beginning to take more lively interest than ever in the study of their character and history.